There with me. Joshua again makes another remembrance, a remembering stone. And I was talking to Bill the other day, and he talked about a witness tree. So years ago, people would inscribe on a tree a witness, things like that. And so it's a typical reality. And we're told here in Joshua 24, verse 21, that the Lord wants us to remember what He has done. The Lord has done so many things for Israel, of course, in the Old Testament. And it's also true that He's done a ton of stuff for you and for me and for our country and for our people. And it's very easy to think, well, nothing good is ever going to happen to our country again. The Lord must be about, a week away or less from coming because the world is falling apart. And maybe that's true, but maybe God has another plan. It's entirely possible that He could send a revival because the revivals that He has sent in the past were incredible. So 21, I'm in Joshua 24, 21, and the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. He just told them, you can't serve the Lord. And it was kind of like a jab at them. You'll never do this. You'll never walk with God. No, we will. They protested and expressed their commitment. We will serve the Lord. And so Joshua said to the people, then you are witness against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord for yourselves to serve Him. And they said, we are witnesses. So they're binding themselves under a contract, a witness. Now therefore, verse 23, he said, put away the foreign gods which are among you, and incline your heart to the Lord God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and His voice we will obey. And so Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and made for them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. Shechem is always like a decision place in Israel. It's often the place where they would come together and decide things. So like a covenantal idea. 26, and then Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and he set it up there under the oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness to us, and it has heard all of the words of the Lord which He spoke to us, and it shall be a witness to you, lest you deny your God. And so Joshua let the people depart, each to his own inheritance. And so there were these constant reminders, 12 stones that were placed in the middle of the Jordan, 12 stones that were taken out of the Jordan, the stone of help, the Ebenezer in 1 Samuel, and the witness stone here, and the tree that it was under, to remind us constantly and over again that God is a good God and He is worthy of serving. And so I'm going to be willing to bet that most of us have never heard very much at all about the revivals that happened during the Civil War. And that's the goal of my time this morning, is to talk about the Civil War. Going back in history, the era, or the time that we're talking about, is literally the Second Great Awakening. First Great Awakening happened in a couple of different times. Remember 1734 and 35, 1741 and 1742. Jonathan Edwards started preaching, and the young people got excited about the Lord, and he became the theologian or the historian of the First Great Awakening, and then it spread from there. Other people, a lot of people will never know about, by the way. We don't want to just say it's just one guy, but there were people who kind of gave direction to it. George Whitefield, and then the Wesleys came and preached, and it went from New England, and then it went to the South. And here's the way that people have described the difference between the First Great Awakening in our country and the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening produced profound political change in our country. So it wasn't even a country, and the awakening happened, and it really changed us as a people. It brought us together. We became one people. It literally ushered in the basis of the revolution, a revolution based on our belief in God. You sometimes hear that everybody was a deist. To the best of my knowledge, there were only 3 people who signed the original Constitutional Convention documents that were deists, and you know 2 of them, because they've been elevated. They've been made heroes when the rest of them were, every single one of them, according to one history book, were faithful members of local churches. So the idea that our original history was secular is just not really very true. So the First Great Awakening produced political change. The Second Great Awakening produced societal change. So it changed the way we're going to be as a people. I'll give you a list of some of the impacts of the Second Great Awakening. But before I do that, let me tell you the times. It's important. Just like the First Great Awakening came in a wave, and then another wave, and then it kind of like spun out for a time. By the time you get to 1799, there was almost no one in most of the major schools that claimed to be believers. They were members of atheist clubs and profanity clubs and all kinds of things. The halfway covenant, which really is akin to infant baptism, not a good thing, by the way. So they kind of let them in the church a little bit. You're kind of good. You don't have personal faith in Jesus, but you've done these things. The halfway covenant resulted in those things. And so by 1800, we were ready for our second revival. And so it happened again in three waves. 1795 to 1810, there were these camp meetings. The camp meetings began in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. And so there were people beginning to preach along the way. There was Timothy Dwight. And so the revival went north to New England. Churches in New England in the second wave went all the way until 1825. So the first one went to 1810, then the second one went to 1825, and then the third wave of the second, I know that's a lot of numbers. So the third aspect of the Second Great Awakening was the revival of Charles Finney. And Charles Finney is the one who brought in the new measures. The new measures were that he was man-centered rather than God-centered. So the first revival, the first awakening was God-centered, strong on election, predestination, sovereignty. You would wait for God, you would pray, and when you finally received a sense of relief and forgiveness, then you would believe that you were finally saved. And the second one, because Finney didn't believe in depravity, he didn't believe literally in the atonement, he preached a revival of good works, social reform. Again, and that's not to say that everybody believed that. Especially in the Civil War, they had the gospel down really, really good. So I'm not saying that he ruined the country. I'm just saying that the new measures, man-centered measures of Finney, has impacted evangelism all the way down to Billy Graham and the typical church today, which is market-driven, seeker-sensitive, those kinds of things. Those are all the outflow of Finney. So here's the impact of what happened because of the Second Great Awakening. Orphanages were built, old age homes, which we would call nursing homes, were established. There were houses for delinquent children and hospitals, and I'll have more to say about hospitals in a little while. By the way, hospitals have always been a Christian institution. There were some Greeks that did a few things. The Romans had like garage stations or whatever, mechanic stations where they might take a soldier or a slave and they would try and get them healthy again because they're a tool, right? And you want to keep your tools working. But it was Christians who came along and ministered to both body and soul. Second and third century AD, when the plagues came through, it was the Christians who went out, the believers, I should say, Christians is too broad, believers who went out and fed people and rescued people and buried people and put their lives on the line, which is exactly what we should do. And the very same thing happened in the Second Great Awakening. And so when we think of hospitals, you think of St. Vincent's and St. Luke's and Mount Sinai and Presbyterian and Mercy and Bethel Israel. Beth Israel, that's a famous hospital, Adventist and Lutheran and Methodist, and even Mayo Clinic, which is considered about the best hospital system in the world. It is Catholic in its background, but still the same mentality of societal reform. Long-term impact of the Second Great Awakening is, they said, gambling over dog fights is probably not a good idea. Rooster fights, we should probably make those illegal. They had a game whereby they would bet on one dog versus 100 rats in a pen to see who could win and which one would, beat the other one. Always a fight to the death. There were gouging fights. Men would grow their fingernails long so that when they fought with other people, they could gouge out their eyes, and that was considered, a unique extra score if you blinded someone. Man against dog. Can you imagine that? Betting over those kinds of things along the way, bare-fisted fighting, things like that. So very bad time. And when the awakening came along, it resulted, in addition to stopping those things, job training programs, homeless shelters, poorhouses, legal aid to Native Americans, anti-alcohol movements, a lot of them. The Sunday school movement, we're here today because we have a Sunday school program, came out of that movement. Seminaries and colleges and schools for girls and schools for blacks and schools for Native Americans and aid for abandoned wives, anti-profanity clubs. Clearly the abolitionist movement. By the way, even the North was not against slavery at the beginning. They struggled. There were a few people. The Adamses were great. John Adams and John Quincy Adams argued against slavery, but others didn't really see the clarity of it. So it was the Second Great Awakening that moved us in that direction, and I'm so thankful for that. Prison reform, the YMCA, the American Bible Society, American Tract Society, multiple missionary movements and societies. So people were being sent all around the world. Asylums for the insane, asylums for the deaf and for the dumb, asylums for the indigent. Dorothy Dix, I thought that's an interesting name, is a pretty famous person. She lived in Boston. She was a school teacher, and she had a lot of time to travel and go through various prisons where they took care of people along the way. And here's what she said. She says, when I went through the prisons, I found that most of the prisons were full of insane persons, and they are confined to cages and closets and cellars and stalls and pens, and they were chained and naked and beaten and lashed. And so she says, that's just not the way we as this people ought to be treating those who are in difficulties. And so she kind of like separated out the idea of those who are criminal versus those who are struggling with other issues and the challenges related to that. In addition to that, one of the things that she found is that 5 out of 6 persons in prison in the North were there for debt. And because they owed debt, they would get thrown in prison. And how do you pay off your debt when you're sitting in jail? It doesn't work. They could be there for years. And by the way, though we shouldn't abuse the idea of being able to declare bankruptcy, I think it's based on the law of Moses. The year of Jubilee, the 7-year period of things going back to people in the 49th year. So I'm grateful for all of those things. And Lauren, you'll be interested in knowing this, that the public school system, and you probably already know this, Horace Mann, 1837. So this is when they said people began to push for a public education system. Not so great today, but it was a good thing for a lot of years. And for that, we ought to be thankful. And maybe we could even reform it. That would be wonderful. Again, the idea of hospitals. I want to mention it to you that as early as 369, Basil of Caesarea, so right in the region of Galilee there, he founded the first hospital in year 369. So how do we get into the Civil War and see what happened in sort of the afterglow or the flow of the Second Great Awakening? There have been these 3 waves which have impacted the North. They impacted Kentucky, regions around there. But in the years, let me give the year 1857, 1858, and 59, there was what was known as the Businessmen's Revival or the Prayer Meeting Revival, things like that. And this is the revival that skipped the South. And I just find that really ironic that the revival of 1857 to 59 spread to Canada, it spread to Europe. A lot of people, D. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was a great preacher in England, believed that this was the greatest revival they ever had over there. And it went everywhere, but it didn't go to the South. And providentially, I think you could say that God was preparing and disciplining the South. Had they come to a point of repentance, then there's one thing that they're going to have to do. And they love their slaves more than they love God. They love their freedoms of being able to sit there and have someone else work for them. And it was a terrible situation. I'm convinced that everyone ought to know about the lost cause doctrine. It's a huge doctrine. Idea was, a couple years after the Civil War, they realized that we really have egg on our face. We really got beat. And they always said, well, those Northerners, they don't have nearly the courage as the South does, and we've got General Lee, things like that. And so they started putting up monuments all over the country in the South to lionize and to turn into saints the generals of the South. So if you think about it today, this might sound controversial. I hope it won't. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of monuments being torn down, and I've had to look at that with a mixed bag because some of them probably should be torn down. I'm not necessarily certain that we should be idolizing people who argued for the rape and murder and kidnapping of a whole society of people. So they started doing that, and they said, well, the Civil War was about states' rights and other things rather than about slavery. And it was clearly about slavery. Everyone knows that. It's one of those things that you just don't want to believe the propaganda that moved it in the other direction. Way back when Anna we were like in the 9th and 10th grade. You know, we did a lot of Civil War studies and visits, went to battlefields. And she listened to someone who was arguing for lost cause. And, you know, so a younger person, that's interesting. Maybe that's it, Dad. So we started doing some research together, and we went to every single founding document of all of the states that seceded. And in each one of them, the reason for secession was to be able to maintain their property, which was slaves. And so that was what it was about. And so they argued that, you know, slavery was nice, you know, the people were happy, they were well educated. Even within the church, it's interesting that, well, we brought them here so they could hear the gospel, things like that along the way. And of course, that's not good. So here we are, back at the revivals. That's the focus of our day. In 1857, on the first week, a man by the name of Lamphere, Lamphier, I don't know his first name, but Mr. Lamphere, in September 23rd, met alone for a prayer meeting, and he was praying, and he asked others to come with him, and after about a half hour, 6 people came. Next Wednesday, when they gathered together, about 20 people came and prayed for revival. On the third week, October 7th, 1857, 40 people came and began to pray for revival, and then it broke into daily prayer for revival, and then by the fall, that revival, you've heard this already from me even, spread all across the region of New York, and people were coming everywhere to pray. Christians were conducting evening services, noonday prayers. The businessmen were closing businesses at midday that were not open. And by April, April of 1858, 10,000 businessmen were gathering daily for prayer in New York. And by May, so we went from September of 57 to May of 58, they claimed that there were over 50,000 converts to Christianity. And again, it went everywhere except in the South. And that's because they were unrepentant. The South is really something. North and South churches split, you know. Even Southern Baptists, there's a reason they're called Southern, because they took a pro-slavery movement. Our denominational group, by the way, we're regular Baptists, but we came out of the Northern Baptists. Not that the Northern Baptists were great theologically, but at least they weren't Southern, you know. So they were dividing. Methodists divided over those kinds of things, as did Presbyterians along the way. And the churches in the South, the pastors who meant Dabney and others that you would know, they argued that the Bible allowed for slavery. They also argued that churches, they taught a kind of pietism. And this is what we heard in Enemies Within the Church the other night. Same thing, that we should be concerned about the spiritual character of our people, and we should not be involved in political actions. And so leave the slavery issue to someone else. Some within the church taught that Negroes, I think it's okay to use the word Negro, that's the way it's described. I want to be careful even about that. But anyways, they taught that they were not descendants of Adam, but they were of a different race, a pre-Adamic race, died before Genesis 1:1, which is really strange. So they argued, some of them, that they did not have a soul. Others taught, and I was taught this, so not shocking to you, and I've heard people within the last year use this argument, talk about it, that African Americans, blacks, were descendants of Ham and descendants of Cain. So Ham was one of the sons of Noah, and because Canaan was cursed in Genesis chapter 9, I think it is, that the black race is cursed. But when you hear the word Canaan, what do you typically think of? You ought to think of Canaan. See how important that is? Because when the children of Israel were rescued from Egypt, they came to the land of Canaan. And because they were so engaged in perversions, everything in the land of Canaan was so bad, that the curse of Ham, or the curse of Canaan, all the way back in Noah's day, was applied to them by the children of Israel. They were God's tool for vindication to destroy the perversions that happened in 1445 BC. So they taught that slavery was a benevolent institution and that slavery brought blacks to America so that they could hear the gospel, and they were just happy people. And one more number, by the way, that's important. They say, well, only 10% of the population had slaves. Well, if you only count the head of household, the numbers were low. But if the husband and the wife and the family had a connection to the slave, then every one of them should be considered owners. And so the numbers were a lot bigger than we would have seen. So anyways, finally, the revival broke out during the Civil War. And if you read in the historians, they typically say that the revivals only happened in the South. And again, what would that be an example of? That would be an example, Christ in the Camp and books like that, they're great. An example of lost cause, that, well, they were more godly, more spiritual, they had revivals. The truth is, as one person said, there were two things about the Civil War that were really interesting. You could stand on a ridge or in a valley, and there might be a fierce battle just over the hill, and you would have an acoustical shadow where you couldn't hear any of the cannons or anything, but people 5-10 miles beyond, you could hear them. That was one of the things that was unique about what they could hear. And the other is people would stand in no man's land, or I don't know, whatever the divider is, where people were, where the pickets would be, and you could sit there and you could hear preachers from the north preaching the gospel of Jesus, and you could turn around and you could hear preachers from the south preaching the very same message to the other side of the movement. And so how do we know what they preached? Well, we really know a lot about the message that happened in the Civil War, and here's how we know what happened. Because if you're a soldier, there would be moments of sheer panic punctuated by weeks and weeks of boredom. So they didn't have a lot to do a lot of the time, and soldiers wrote lots and lots of letters back home, and back home wrote fewer and fewer letters to their soldiers. So a lot of letters came home. Of course, if you sent letters to a soldier, they probably wouldn't have survived. They would have been lost. But a lot of letters went home, and they typically described the sermons that they heard in the Civil War. And so both North and South, equal numbers, I'll give you the numbers after a while, their most favorite subject was the providence of God. That they believed God is in control. It gave them great hope and security. And as you'd hear generals and leaders talk about, you're no more safe behind a stone or behind a tree than you are just standing in line, because God wills and He's in control of everything. So they loved and found great help and hope in the providence of God. They had vigorous singing of great hymns of the faith. You could hear that all over the place. There was a very strong determination in the soldiers to find and have peace with God. They were going to die. They assumed they were going to die. And so they wanted peace with God. There was a very clear, and I loved it to see this, there was a very clear and repeated explanations of the Gospels. Lots of letters talked about what Jesus did, and talked about faith and repentance, and that, you know, the human heart is wicked, and that we're all sinners, and God's grace is important, and Jesus Christ in their letters is the perfect atonement. They talked about the drama of salvation in the Old Testament, and they used words like propitiation. Wonderful stuff. They talked about the dangers, the soldiers did, of being religious without knowing God. So you could almost say that because their feet were under the fire, and they could live and die at any moment, I think it resulted in maybe the purest of the revivals that happened among the people. But the revival in the South did not come until they lost two major battles. And the reason that matters is at the beginning of the war, Bull Run, remember that? The South believed that the North could never beat them, And they always took that as a sign of something. They took it as a sign of the providence and the faithfulness of God to protect them. In fact, all their generals, they interpreted every single winning battle as an indication that God was on their side until Antietam came. I'll give you the date. Antietam, which is a bridge, by the way, September 17th, I have 1962, but I'm sure it's 1862 in my notes. So Antietam Bridge, there were several battles that happened all on that same day. There was the battle in the cornfield, and a lot of soldiers, as they were coming through the cornfield at one side, someone on the other side noticed a glint of a sparkling spear or something that shined, and he had all of his army point over at the cornfield, and they just blew the cornfield to death. And of course, all the soldiers died in line. It's really a striking thing. There was the sunken road where they got trapped, some of them, and became like shooting ducks in a barrel or fish in a barrel, things like that. And then there was the bridge. And so in Antietam's bridge, Burnside was on the one side. This is the only way to get over the Rapidan River. And so they would rush the soldiers on the other side, and they would shoot from both banks, and they would drive them back, and then they would do it again. And they fought all day long from daylight until dark. And finally, just at dark, the north, Burnside, he finally, and the sideburn, by the way, that's him. So if you grow sideburns, you're doing that in honor of Burnside. They finally made it over, and just then the South got reinforcements that had come from 17 or 20 miles away and pushed them back over the bridge. And so they ended the day at exactly where they started the day, which was declared to be a victory for the North. I'm not quite sure how they rationalized that, but everyone recognized it was a victory. Maybe how strategic the bridge was or what was going on. And after Antietam, when they got beat, what did the president do, by the way? He was waiting for a victory before he could do something. This is when he declared the Emancipation Proclamation. And so he declared that because you don't declare a victory after you've lost a battle. You do it when you win. And this really knocked the socks off the South. And all of a sudden, they began to think differently. God used that to bring revival to the South, and they started turning to God. The other great battle, which is one you'll be more familiar with, July of 1863, July 1, 2, and 3, which is Gettysburg. 55,000 soldiers died in that over 3 days. By the way, Antietam was the largest one-day losses of any battle in the Civil War. There were some bad ones. Cold Harbor was bad. Gettysburg was bad. But in one day, Antietam was the worst. Gettysburg is often known as the dividing line or the high water mark, of the war. After that, the South got pushed away. And if the North would have pursued them a little bit more, we probably could have done more to end the war quicker. But McClellan didn't really seem to want to do that. It seemed like he wanted to appease the South along the way. Anyway, so the point of all of that is simply, after the losses, after they began to see that maybe God wasn't blessing us, that's when they started turning to the Lord. And one man wrote in the letter, "I never saw men who were better prepared to receive religious instruction and advice. The dying begged for our prayers or our songs, and every evening we would gather around the wounded and sing and pray. Many wounded who had before now hitherto led wicked lives became entirely changed." And so the revival of 1863, people say that about 10% of all of the soldiers had come to trust in Jesus. Along the Rapidan River, there were 37 different structures like tabernacles, whatever, about one every 800 yards where they would roll logs together and make seating areas. 300 to 500 people would come every night to hear preaching and instruction and things like that. There were 60 log chapels that were constructed around Richmond, Virginia for the soldiers to come. And during this time, not the whole war, but just during this time, over 100,000 Confederates and perhaps as many as 200,000 Union soldiers came to trust in Jesus. They would share their Bibles, and they had great reading clubs. If there was water nearby, guess what they would do? They would baptize summer or winter. Wherever, if you got saved, they would send you down in the water, and you would get baptized. And here are the final numbers that I've read from different books. Some estimate that in the end, as many as 250,000 Confederates trusted Christ before the war was over, and perhaps as many as 150,000 from the Union from the North. One man wrote to several of the Bible college presidents, and he was trying to find out if the revival had any kind of long-term impact. And this is my final quote, and I'm done for the day. He says, I wrote to Bible college presidents, and I asked if any of the conversions, or to what degree the conversions of the Civil War were genuine. And they said that about 4 out of 5 of the men pursuing ministry had made a commitment to become a minister during the war, and the majority of them who did that had been saved during the Civil War. And so if you don't think that that didn't change the country, to have all of these soldiers coming home, it would be, in Revelation you have the 144,000. Remember that? And they go out into all the world and they become evangelists. You've got more than 144,000 soldiers going all across the country. And that's why the list is so large. I won't read it again, of all of the things that happened in our country during that time. And I take it as a great set of revivals. And for that, we ought to be entirely grateful. And remember and anticipate again. Any comments, questions? You all probably know as much as the rest of us on the Civil War and revivals and what strikes you as important. It's interesting. Esther, sent me a text this week. What do you think about public education? And I don't know. I still don't know. But yes. Yeah.
And she said, I've been trying to find a picture of Abraham Lincoln to bring into my classroom, and I can't find one.
Can't find one.
Now, I was in college in 1963, and she could not find a picture of Abraham Lincoln in a school in Virginia.
Isn't that something? Yeah. I don't know what president he was. 27, 30? Anybody know? 16. Great. Thank you, Don.
So the Civil War was apparently alive and well still.
Yeah. Since I've already broached the subject, and I might as well say it one more time, the lost cause doctrine resulted in all of the blue laws and all of the things that happened in the 1960s. Because basically, it allowed them to keep their racial prejudices for 100 years. And then in 64, they claimed that, no, it's the Republicans who are racist, and they've always been the nice people. They call it like the Great Reversal, which never happened. And honestly, I'm not ashamed to say I think they're still racist. So.
On something in that era with Johnson, when he started passing all that.
Sure. He got the Republicans to vote with them.
The Republicans voted for that act by like 82,
They did.
and the Democrats were 23.
Yeah, they did not want it. Yeah. Yeah.
Those were Northern Democrats.
Yeah. Interesting.
It's still.
But they think that the Democrats passed all that, but it was Republicans, yeah. There's a reason why one party thinks that a particular group of people don't know how to get a photo ID and can't figure out where voting places are, and that we ought to protect them. It's because in their mind there's, and I'm really meddling now, but so I don't mind saying that. I'll go right to you just a minute. That it's okay to be political when politics is theological, when it's wrong, and I think that's good. So go ahead.
There's an article that the NRA was founded by Union soldiers
Yes.
teaching free black people
Yes.
how to protect themselves and use guns after they're free.
Because gun control,
That founded the NRA.
yeah, gun control was a way to keep blacks from getting guns. And so the NRA was the other side. So, Steve, yeah, go ahead. I hope I have opened up a can of worms. But